Welcome to another Indxx Insights podcast, where we break down key trends shaping the global economy. I'm your host, Rahul Sen Sharma, and today we're diving into the emerging shift in global trade, which we call reglobalization. Joining me today, once again, is Vaibhav Agarwal, our special guest and Chief Product Officer here at Indxx. Vaibhav, welcome back.
Thanks, Rahul, for having me here.
So let's dive right in. So I mentioned reglobalization, but first, for decades, we'd heard about and been talking about globalization, which is, of course, the increasing connectivity of the world and of trade and of everything that happens on a global basis. But what we've seen in recent years, especially with the pandemic, are significant changes. We've seen geopolitical tensions, technological advances, and other problems that have caused companies and countries to rethink global supply chains and international cooperation. So my question for you, Vaibhav, is are we merely seeing a reshuffling of supply and production chains, or is this a paradigm shift and the start of a new trend towards deglobalization or reglobalization?
Great question, Rahul. There's been a lot of discussion around this trend that some people like to refer to as deglobalization. I don't like the term myself, and at Indxx, we actually like to call it reglobalization. Because if you really think about it and if you look what's happening, countries are not getting de-linked from each other. Rather, they are reorienting their supply chains, their trade links, and just how they do business in terms of interacting with each other through technological means or through trade means. Now, why we think this trend is important to discuss or important for from an investing point of view as well is because this leads to a fundamental reimagining of global trade networks. So instead of dismantling of international relations or international commerce, companies and countries are building smarter, more resilient regional networks. Trade is here to stay. I don't think we're going back to isolationist economies, but what we are witnessing here is a reimagining of those trade links.
So if we look at trade as almost like a global machine, what it sounds like you're saying is that we're not really seeing a cutting of trade entirely or cutting of power entirely. It's more like a rewiring of global trade networks and circuits. Is that a fair statement?
That's actually a very good analogy. It's about building redundancies and resilience into the system. Now, companies are not going to give on global trade. I mean, if they were to do that, I mean, you'd have skyrocketing inflations worldwide. Companies are not giving up on global trade. They're just getting smarter about it. And some of it is geopolitical, some of it is driven by other economic factors. But look at what happened during the last US-China trade war during the first presidency of Donald Trump. I think US imposed tariffs of around 66% on Chinese imports. Did that lead to US importing less from China? Yes, but that also led to US importing more from alternate countries. So you had Asian countries stepping in, you had India, Latin America. They stepped in to fill that gap. So instead of trade collapsing, what we saw was trade getting reorganized along new lines, creating more resilient and more diverse supply chains.
That's an interesting observation. What's really important is how multiple global events have really pushed countries to prioritize economic resilience, as you said. The US-China trade tensions that you referenced were just the beginning, right? I mean, now, during his second term, President Trump has pretty quickly implemented, first now, strategic tariffs on Mexico and Canada of 25%, which he's abated or temporarily paused, and an additional 10% on Chinese goods. So this is kind of accelerating the trend towards protectionism. In addition to that, we saw how Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered immediate protectionist responses where 24 countries put export bans in place on essential food items like wheat, sugar, and oil. And then, of course, you have the semiconductor crisis of 2020, where you had a huge shortage of semiconductors and widespread consequences that affected industries like electronics and automobiles globally. These events, in my mind at least, really expose how vulnerable our highly efficient but brittle global supply chains are. What factors do you see driving this push towards reglobalization?
First of all, you don't need to remind me of the 2020 semiconductor crisis. I got my Tesla at, I think, 2x the price it is today. But you've highlighted some very crucial events here, Rahul, and they all point to a fundamental weakness in our traditional globalized system. Think about it. I mean, the disruptions that we've seen actually form a domino effect over the past 15 years. It's not recent, and it all started back in 2008 with the financial crisis, and there were talks of eastern economies delinking themselves from western ones. So the talk of reorientation of supply chains, of reimagining trade relations actually started back then. It has intensified in the last few years. That's when the governments began to seriously question unrestricted global trade and started implementing protective barriers. Fast forward to today, and you mentioned Donald Trump introducing, being very quick with implementing tariffs, although in abeyance right now, on Canada and Mexico and some other countries to come. But implementation of these tariffs is not in isolation. It's a strategic move by the U.S. So tariffs on Mexico and Canada will somehow, in US or in Donald Trump's mind, lead to strengthening of US domestic production. And that's again another way of reorienting the supply chains, on bringing the manufacturing, what we call reshoring, bringing them onshore, bring them inside the US. What's also interesting is that each crisis pushed countries towards the same solution, building more resilient, regionalized networks. This isn't just about protectionism. It's about creating systems that can actually withstand future shocks. That's the essence of reglobalization.
We talked a little bit about different tariffs that President Trump has put in place thus far and then abated. But something that we haven't really talked about is how this has also created a huge amount of uncertainty. Tariff comes in place, it gets changed. There's threats and potential warnings that there might be tariffs on other countries globally. So all of these things really create a crisis of uncertainty for countries and for companies. So I guess, when we look at how companies are trying to adapt to this new reality, there simply isn't just one playbook, right? I mean, could you help listeners just try and understand that part of it a little bit better?
To understand it, it's also important to sort of see that whatever is happening around the globe in terms of trade, it's, as I mentioned, it's not really protectionism, it's reorientation, but then it's also a geopolitical negotiating tactic. As we said, we're not going to go away from global trade ever, because we're so interconnected today, but companies have to be prepared. Because even if it's a negotiating tactic for some of these political minds, it has downstream implications on how companies conduct their trade practices. So, how are they reacting? How are some of the countries or companies reacting? Some are building strategic reserves. They are stockpiling. Basically, you want to avoid inflation. And it's a supply and demand driven economies globally. So you build onto your supplies far enough so that any kind of disruption to that doesn't affect your supply in the future, because demand is not going to go down. The other thing that companies are doing is diversifying their supply chains. So not relying on one single supplier, but looking at multiple suppliers in some of the more friendly countries, or some of the countries that are in the close neighborhood, or what we call nearshoring. But I think the most important aspect of companies and countries sort of getting on this trend is what we call nearshoring, and in that they're trying to bring the supply chains or manufacturing near their shores, or with US trying to do that with Mexico and basically neighboring countries.
So that's interesting because a lot of these things that you talk about, friendshoring, nearshoring, shifting global supply chains, are already, and the tariffs as well, they're already starting to show impacts globally. If you look at the US, for example, what I read was that steel production has risen above 80% of capacity, and primary aluminum has increased by 64% since imposing tariffs on China. These are just two examples, but what are your thoughts on how these changes might affect different economies?
You made a great point, Rahul, about production shifts. While reglobalization can boost a nation's self-efficiency or self-sufficiency, it also brings some significant risks, like inflation in the short term. We spoke about, if you try to bring everything internal, how that can, disrupt the supply chains. And any disruption in supply chains can cause inflation. When imports are restricted, supply shrinks while demand stays the same, so pushing prices up. On top of that, it could lead to greater economic volatility with less international risk sharing. Another downside is higher production costs. Now, you see what Trump is trying to do with sending the illegals out of the country. Now, these illegals, as we know, are employed in two basic sectors: agriculture and manufacturing, home building. Now, if we have to hire replacements for these workers, for example, we'll have to hire them at a much increased cost. And what that will eventually lead to is home prices going up, grocery prices going up, and it all works in anticipation. And this is also already evident, with the implementation of President Trump's 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports scheduled for March this year. US steel prices in expectation have gone up already. Economics works with on expectations. We all know inflation is basically built into the system in terms of getting expectations from the consumers. And if you see tariffs going up, even in future, prices start going up as a leading indicator of that and not as a lagging indicator. Bain and Company research indicates 40% of executives anticipate double-digit increases in their input costs due to these tariffs.
It's really interesting that, again, you mentioned the steel and aluminum because, I talked about capacity increasing rapidly in steel and aluminum production here in the US. That doesn't mean costs are going down. In fact, just the opposite here, as you mentioned. Even though US capacity has increased and production has increased, costs can still go higher. And I think that's an important thing to recognize. We've been talking about all these changes that are happening. Is there a way to measure what stage of reglobalization we're at right now?
It's a challenging question, to be honest, because it's an ongoing trend. But there are several economic indicators that can help us assess the situation. Key markers of reglobalization include, rise in trade barriers, such as tariffs and quotas, along with the decline in FDIs. So, there are indicators out there that you can use to measure what's happening around there, but there's no definitive answer right now on how you can measure where we are, in this trend of reglobalization.
Well, from an indexing standpoint, there are many benchmarks that track various sectors like manufacturing or semiconductor. We have a bunch, as do our competitors out there. With global supply chains breaking down, does that open up new investment opportunities for region-specific or sector-specific indexes?
Absolutely. Global supply chains, as you mentioned, are breaking down. They're getting reoriented, and that will lead to growing investment opportunities in regional and sector-specific indexes. Sectors like manufacturing, industrials, and defense in the US are likely to see increased interest as supply chains move from global just-in-time kind of supply chains to domestic or nearshore production. You talked about some of the indexes we have. I think a big beneficiary of this trend is going to be infrastructure. For example, the Global X US Infrastructure Development ETF, PAVE, which tracks our index, by the way, I assume that that's going to be, one of the at the forefront of, some of the ETFs that are going to benefit from this trend of reshoring, nearshoring, reorientation, and reglobalization.
These are really interesting insights. Maybe now, as we start wrapping up, can you summarize all of this just briefly for people who are listening? What should they really be focused on? What are the key points and takeaways?
Certainly. I think what we've discussed is, reglobalization or deglobalization for the larger audience is a trend that's here to stay. Doesn't mean global trade is going away. What that means is there's going to be a reorientation of supply chains, leading to through some tariffs and quotas, possibly leading to some inflation in the near term. But based on our research at Indxx, we've identified 5 key pillars driving reglobalization, and I list down those 5 for the benefit of our audience. They are manufacturing and reshoring, as we discussed. And if you have to bring, supply chains onshore or nearshore and avoid inflation, automation and digitalization becomes very important. Inflation protection, of course, by other means is also going to be a key driver. And then energy security. You mentioned semiconductor. A lot of critical metals and minerals US currently imports from countries that are not so friendly. And so it will lead to reorientation in supply chains from an energy security point of view because energy demand is just going to go up. And last but not the least, data protectionism and cybersecurity. This is an often neglected point, Rahul, to be honest, but it's also going to be one of the most important, drivers of reglobalization, because with increased delinkages or relinkages, data is going to be a big thing from a geopolitical lens, from a industry espionage perspective, and all data protectionism or data security issues that we see today in the world. So these are the 5 trends we think are going to be the major drivers of reglobalization.
Well, it's really interesting you mentioned energy security and critical metals because obviously we've been focused at Indxx on critical metals for more than a year now. And you're starting to see more and more countries try and safeguard their access to critical metals, most recently with President Trump and Ukraine and access to rare earth and critical metals as well. So it really seems like this is a trend that's going to continue. Thanks for all of your insights. I think it's pretty clear that Reglobalization isn't just a response to recent events, it's a strategic shift that's happening in how we approach global trade and economic relationships between companies, between countries, and between end users as well. So thank you, Vaibhav, for breaking this down. And it's really been interesting to learn more about the future of global trade.
Thanks, Rahul. It's been a pleasure.
So that wraps up another episode of the Indxx Insights podcast. Be sure to tune in next time for another exciting discussion. Feel free to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed this as well.